Hey, Sun Devils, this is Mr. Moore here with week 30 class notes for AP European History. This week we're covering the Cold War. The Cold War is World War III that hasn't happened yet. The Cold War was the preparing for and the planning for and stockpiling of weapons for and training militaries for and putting them on alert for World War III that didn't quite happen. It didn't heat up to real combat between the major players. And so historians refer to this time period after World War II up to the 1990s as the Cold War. It's a general concept that covers like 40 years of history, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. Essentially, those 4 decades are referred to as the Cold War. So, what was the Cold War? Well, we were about ready to annihilate each other with nuclear weapons. At the end of World War II, the major winners of World War II had a really intense relationship. Okay. Stalin didn't trust the other allies, and quite frankly, Stalin was as bad as Hitler. But somehow we ended up on the same team. I guess because we saw Hitler as a more immediate threat, and once Hitler was removed and out of the picture, it became very clear that Stalin was a bad guy and that Stalin was a problem. And it's not like we waited until the end of World War II to notice this, but at the same time, that old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, did kind of play out in World War II. How close did we come to World War III? You know? And what would nuclear war look like? And how does the Cold War affect the geopolitics of our world today? This is the part of class where history stops becoming history for some of us. When I was growing up, I was in grade school and middle school, during the 1980s. And I did high school during the early 1990s. So I grew up in an era of the Cold War. That's not history to me. That's my childhood. That's real and relevant, and it was something that all of us had in the back of our minds at all times. Now, maybe my deepest concern here is that we still have nuclear weapons on the planet Earth today, and we sometimes still have tensions with Russia. We've been blaming Russia on interfering in US elections in the last two elections. I've heard that across major media outlets. Hey, the Russians are interfering with US elections. So maybe there is still some Cold War tension left over. And one of the biggest concerns that, intelligent people have is what do we do with all of the nuclear weapons, the atomic bombs that we've created and stockpiled as countries in preparation for the Cold War, to this World War III? We still have those, and we've disarmed some, but we still have enough to eradicate our species from off the planet Earth. And I think that's a really, really fascinating concept. And we're going to deal with a 40-year chunk of time from the end of World War II till when Mr. Moore was in high school, the 1990s. So let's dive in. The Cold War is a military and nuclear standoff between the US and the USSR from 1947 to 1991, about 40 years. Now, some people will say it was maybe even started during World War II. People can trace the roots of this back to 1945 and earlier, when there was a growing tension between the Allied powers. Some people will say that the Cold War didn't end in 1991 because there still are communist countries on the planet Earth in fierce competition with the United States. But when the Soviet Union broke apart into 15 different countries, that's what most historians will say is the end of the Cold War. But again, we still have nuclear weapons, and countries are still armed with nuclear weapons. So that potential is still real. The Cold War was the planning and the preparations for World War III, but it never heats up to full out war. And again, that's why we call it the Cold War. There are hotspots, though, and these are the ones that are famous to Americans, but there are hot spots for European powers in Algeria. There are hot spots in Vietnam for France. Um, European powers do join the US in the Korean Peninsula. So when Americans talk about wars after World War II, it becomes kind of tricky because World War II is the last war where we put it all on the line to win. Like, we'll do whatever we have to win. But at the end, the way World War II ends sets the stage for wars afterward. No country's ever gone all in because the price for winning might be too high. And the stakes that are involved when we deal with nuclear weapons are so significant that it's really, really hard for us to comprehend. I hope by the end of this discussion, you will understand it. So, the Korean conflict, there's my air quotes, and the Vietnam conflict, the United States Congress never declared war in Korea or Vietnam, and we purposely didn't declare war because we didn't want to go all in. And if we declared war, we were nervous about the Soviet Union or China backing those countries that were communist based in their government. And we were scared at what scale it would get to because everybody really was shell shocked from World War I and World War II. And some of the guys who were the top commanders during Korea, like let's take MacArthur as an example. He was a military leader during World War I, and he was the top U.S. military commander during World War II in the Pacific. And he was the top U.S. military commander during the Korean conflict until the end of the conflict when he wanted to use nuclear weapons and drop atomic bombs on China because China was sending military support over to Korea. And he said, "We can't win if you're tying my hands, we can't win." And the president of the United States says, "We can't go all in to win. Maybe we can't win this war, but we can't afford to go all in." And so some people will say, "Oh, Vietnam was the first war that the United States lost." And I would say, well, if you say that, you really need to know what you're talking about because every military engagement we undertook in Vietnam, we won. We killed more Vietnamese than they killed of Americans. And it seems like every major operation we went in and kicked the trash out of our enemy. But at the same time, we didn't go into Vietnam to win. We weren't there to take over. And we couldn't declare war because then China would declare war or the Soviet Union would declare war, and then boom, we're into World War III. So we're walking this really fine line, this tightrope, if you will, politically during the Cold War era. And it's a time period that your parents, I imagine, or your grandparents are very familiar with. The Cold War is a conflict of ideologies. The US, with its capitalism and its democracy, versus the Soviet Union with its ideas of communism and totalitarianism. Remember, the USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the leader during World War II was Stalin. But today we're going to talk about some of the other communist leaders that ran the Soviet Union after Stalin. In some ways, we're going to take up to almost modern times in these notes. And we're not going to be able to cover everything, but we're going to try to give you an outline, from the end of World War II, which, again, World War II ended in 1945, but within a couple of years, it was clear that the Allies just weren't going to get along, all the way up again until the 1990s. The Soviet Union, the USSR, is comprised of 15 modern day countries, okay, that made up the old Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. So let me just jump over to a map right here, real quick, and kind of show you what I'm talking about when I say the Soviet Union. You all know that today, Russia is the world's biggest country. And this is Russia right here, okay? But there were other countries that were gobbled up and swallowed up by the Soviet Union, okay? So if you're familiar with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, those were all a part of the Soviet Union. Okay? All of those countries made up one country. So even though Russia is still the biggest country on the planet Earth, I think it's really important to remember that the Soviet Union was even bigger. And then there's countries around the Soviet Union that the Soviet Union controlled. And that's one of the things that we're going to get into. Everywhere that the Red Army took over at the end of World War II, the Soviets kept under their sphere of influence. And that really is all of Eastern Europe. So we're going to get into that here in a minute. I don't want to jump too far ahead. I'd like to address a couple of things. Number one is the Cold War. If you look at this, these are some hot spots. Right here at the top, you see Cold War hotspots from 1948 to 75. Obviously, again, the Cold War is going to go all the way until 1991, but it's really the 50s, 60s, and 70s that probably are the most intense. Okay, the fear of nuclear annihilation is at its height. Okay, the United States, right after World War II, the United States helped Greece defeat communist rebels. Okay, and we also gave huge military aid to Turkey. Remember the old Ottoman Empire? Well, we were looking for friends in the eastern part of Europe, and the Ottoman Empire had kind of been the natural enemy of Russia. And so Turkey took foreign aid from the United States. So we were able to place missiles and military bases in Turkey and Greece. Okay. Number two, communists gained or retained power after a bloody war in Korea and Vietnam. So right after World War II, communist factions in Korea start and ignite a war on the Korean Peninsula that the U.S. gets involved in the 50s. And then throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, for almost 3 decades, there's serious military conflict in Vietnam. As the French Empire is falling apart, this area was controlled by France. French Indochina starts to fall apart, and the United States gets brought into that. Okay. The Soviet Union downs a U.S. spy plane in the 60s. That was a big deal. The Soviet Union said, you can't fly your planes over our territory and spy on us. And the United States said, we're not. And then the Soviets said, we know you are because we shot one of your planes down and we have one of your pilots prisoner. So they kind of caught us, with our pants down or with our hands all covered in red. That's the, caught red-handed, that's kind of the expression, but serious problems. The United States has a major problem because there's a country right next to Florida, right in the Caribbean, right next to the United States that goes communist. And eventually by the 1960s, the Soviet Union is supplying nuclear warheads to Cuba, creating probably the most tense part of the Cold War, the closest we ever came to World War III. President of the United States at the time, JFK, right, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, he draws a line. He said, if Soviet boats cross this line to deliver the nuclear weapons in Cuba, we're going to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. And thankfully, the Soviet ships turned around. The reason that the Soviets were putting missile bases in Cuba is because the United States had already put them in Turkey right next to the Soviet Union. Sometimes United States historians will omit that part, right? They're like, how dare the Soviet Unions try to place nuclear weapons 50 miles off the coast or 90 miles off the coast of the United States? And most people will say, well, that's because we put them in Turkey. We're literally a country touching the Soviet Union. Anyways, the Soviet Union started giving aid to countries in Africa as they broke away from their European controllers. And so there was definitely some hot spots in actual fighting. Communist rebels or the United States would back non-communist rebels to fight against governments. There was violence that happened in Indonesia, significant. The British tried to help Indonesia repress a communist uprising. Remember, these were Dutch-controlled areas, but the Dutch just didn't have the power or military might after World War II. The British barely did, right? The United States also tried to intervene in some rebellions, especially in Chile and in Guatemala. And here's the sad part of the Cold War. Sometimes the United States backed really bad leaders because they were anti Soviet. So sometimes the United States would give military aid to complete jerks, dictators, right? There's a reason they call them a dictator, right? They're just a jerk. But we would give fundage to these military dictators just because they were anti-communist or anti-Soviet. And so we started to build a bad reputation in some places during the Cold War. So that's just a little preview of some of the things. I guess the other big one that we probably should address right now is because the world's largest populated country, China, country with the biggest population, China, is still a communist country. And the communist government still runs China to this very day. And China completely and fully goes communist right after World War II. The the Chinese Civil War or the Communist Revolution of China started before World War II. The communists and nationalists stopped fighting each other. In a previous notes, we talked about Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, and we talked about Mao Zedong and his communist army that duked it out before World War II, kind of paused fighting each other to fight the Japanese during World War II. And then as soon as the Japanese were defeated, went right back at each other's throats. But China is probably the most significant one to talk about. This is not a U.S. history class, so I'm not going to take a ton of time to go into the Korean War or Korean conflict. It happens 5 years after World War II. The basic plot is early in the war, communists instigated a takeover of the entire Korean peninsula, and they had created a pre-war boundary. At the end of World War II, the United States asked for Soviet help to beat the Japanese. After Hitler was defeated, then the Soviets promised to help finish off the Japanese in the Pacific. And so the Soviets and their communist brethren in China kind of drew a boundary in the lines, the 38th parallel, where there was a communist influence backed by the Soviet Union. And after World War II, of course, the Soviet Union can't come right out and say, we're doing this, because then they know the United States would declare war on them. So it was more one of those Soviet Union saying, we have nothing to do with it. It's, if the Koreans want to take control of their own country, that's an internal conflict. But everybody knows the Soviets were backing the communists in the north, and the U.S. was backing the capitalistic democratic system in the south. And so we already had U.S. military personnel in Korea, kind of keeping the peace after Japanese occupation. And so the communists pushed the American and UN allies all the way to almost extinction in South Korea. Then the U.S. landed troops, okay, and pushed the North Koreans almost all the way, they're communist, almost all the way out. But then millions of Chinese communist troops that had just finished their own communist revolution in China crossed the river into the Korean peninsula. And we kind of settled right back where we started. And technically, North and South Korea never finished the war. So technically, the two countries are like still at war. There's a really intense DMZ, demilitarized zone. I mean, it's pretty famous. You can go Google it or watch some YouTube on it. But they have really intense border between the two, with landmines and barbed wire fences and active military patrols. Okay. So that maybe is the general gist of the Korean War. To understand the Korean War, remember who controlled Korea before World War II and who controls it after World War II. Remember, before World War II, the Japanese controlled it. And at the end, Allied troops, the Russians, the communists, the Soviet Union, and then the United States, France, and Great Britain. Really, the United States was controlling the South, okay? Vietnam is a lot more complicated, and what you need to know is imperialism. Vietnam was controlled by the French government at the beginning of World War II, Well, back to the 1800s, they called it French Indochina. But at the beginning of World War II, remember the France gets its butt kicked by the Germans. And so France loses really control of Indochina, and the Japanese gobble it up. And at first, a lot of the people in Vietnam were excited to have other Asians, controlling their country instead of Europeans. But the Japanese were ruthless. At the end of World War II, the Vietnamese people wanted to have the country for themselves, and they started an armed resistance. And the French really were in no position. They had got their butt kicked in World War II. They were honestly still shell shocked from World War One. And so the French Empire is really just not in any position um, to have a say in who's controlling Vietnam. And there was a Vietnamese guy named Ho Chi Minh who actually went to university, got educated in France. And when he went back to Vietnam, he really helped start the resistance. He was much more of a nationalist than a communist, but he does end up taking aid from the communist in China and from the communist in the Soviet Union. And so this becomes a part of the Cold War. And when the French can't control Vietnam anymore, then the United States steps in. So we kind of stepped in to try to resolve the problem that the French maybe couldn't. And that's why the US gets involved slowly, piece by piece. There's ugly parts of it. We ended up backing some real jerks, and we didn't understand who exactly was the enemy because it wasn't like a battlefield. Sometimes a battlefield is really clear where there's clear lines, tanks and helicopters and planes and soldiers and troops. But Vietnam was like, we ended up dropping small platoons in the middle of enemy territories to try to do a little mission. And instead of actually gaining any territory, we ended up kind of keeping track of who was winning by the body count. And that's not exactly a way to win a war. And as I've explained before, we weren't really there to win. I mean, what were we trying to do? We were trying to support a non communist government in the South. And of course, there's famous protests that happen. We dropped more bombs on North Vietnam than we did on Germany during World War II. So it's definitely a war, even though the United States Congress didn't declare it a war. Okay. Um, I think it's really important to make sure you're aware of the Soviet Union. The capital of the entire Soviet Union was Moscow. That's still the capital of Russia. Remember, the Soviet Union was more than just Russia, okay? It was Russia and the surrounding countries that were part of this Soviet bloc. There were also some other countries that were dominated by the Soviet Union. We're going to talk about the Warsaw Pact in a minute. But anyways, you're probably very familiar with, say, Red Square. Red, of course, is the symbolic color of communism. There are still 5 communist countries in the world today: China, North Korea, also Cuba, Vietnam, right? There are some other ones like Laos and Cambodia that are on the edge of communism. Um, and Burma even kind of definitely hints towards that direction sometimes. So it's interesting. Remember, communism is on the far left of the political spectrum, further left than we would say maybe socialism or socialist, although sometimes people use those words interchangeably. Um, I think this is kind of interesting. There's something called the Fermi paradox. And I know this is going to sound kind of random, but in dealing with nuclear weapons and the ability that we have on the planet Earth to annihilate all human life, there's this point where where a civilization reaches the point where it has the ability to destroy itself. Imagine a bunch of really smart, well-educated people sitting around on their lunch break discussing aliens. I know, Mr. Moore, what are you talking about, aliens? Well, what is the probability of there being extraterrestrial life somewhere in the universe? And mathematically, when you start doing the calculation of the billions of stars and the billions of galaxies that are out there, at some point you're going to figure mathematically the probability of having another planet with intelligent life is big. There's probably intelligent life out there somewhere. So the question becomes, well, where are they? How come they haven't communicated with us? How come we haven't seen them? Or maybe they have and we just didn't realize it. But one of the questions becomes this very fact of the Cold War. At some point, an intelligent civilization will come to the point of technology where they can destroy themselves. And the question is, did they survive that stage? Are we going to survive this stage? We still have the potential to annihilate ourselves. We're our own worst enemies. So, one of the questions is maybe the reason we haven't discovered intelligent life in the universe is because maybe they didn't get past this point, that point in civilization where you could destroy yourself. So, how World War II ends sets up the Cold War. Remember, at the end of World War II, the Allied powers of the United States and the United Kingdom, along with the Canadians, invaded France at the beaches of Normandy to help liberate France, right? To break France free from Nazi control. And so we picked up our French allies along the way. The US, the UK, and France pushes in on Germany from the west. And the Soviet Union, I just drew one arrow, but they're pushing from every direction in on Germany. And of course, what's going to happen is we're going to end up dividing up Germany into military zones because this is the second time in the same century that we fought a war with Germany. So, literally, at the end of World War II, we're going to actually turn Germany into military zones. And the capital of Germany, I don't know if you know how far east Berlin is, but Berlin is really close to Poland. So we're also going to take the capital city of Berlin and we're going to divide that into four pieces. So here's an actual map, the occupation zones of Germany. Okay. So remember, Berlin is the capital, and the Soviets end up taking over this chunk of Germany. The British are going to militarily occupy this piece of Germany. The French, obviously the part right next to France, and the United States is going to take its own chunk. But we also took the city of Berlin, the capital, and divided it into four quarters. But as you can tell, it's completely within the Soviet area. And this is really important for you to understand if you're going to understand the Berlin Wall or the Berlin Airlift, or you're going to, in order to understand why Berlin is such a hot spot. So, why not let Stalin have Berlin? Why not just let him have the entire thing? The Allies just didn't want to give him full control over the German capital. And that was one of the things that was negotiated at the end of World War II. So after World War II, Germany was divided among the winners. And just so you remember, like I've talked about this in class, the US still has military bases in Germany and other places in Europe. Still to this very day, a couple of years back, my brother, serving in the Air Force, he still is, but he was stationed in Germany, right? And he lived in a little tiny German village, Dudendorf, and he worked next to an Air Force base, Spangdahlem. And, he was an engineer for the Air Force. I say he still is, but he's not in Germany anymore. And it was really cool. We went to this little town that he was living in Germany. And of course, I'm giddy about European history. And so we're walking down the middle of the town, and there's this little archway going into the center of this little village. And he says, see all these scrape marks on this archway? Those are from when General Sherman drove his tanks through the middle of town. General sorry, General Sherman, Patton. Sorry, I was thinking of the Sherman tanks, is what I was thinking of. The Sherman tanks was a famous tank during World War II, and instead I said, but it's definitely General Patton who was driving Sherman tanks. Anyways, goes through the center of this town, and he was showing me all the scrape marks, and I can still visually see that in my mind. It was really cool. But it's interesting, like even my life and my brother's life have been affected by World War II because he actually served in Germany. We still have military bases there to this very day. So didn't mean to confuse you on that part. The Soviet Union wanted to punish Germany after the war, but the other allies wanted peace. So here's where we pause and we go back to World War I. Remember the end of World War I, how France really wanted to punish Germany for all the problems of World War I? and so they forced Germany to pay reparations, and they enforced the Versailles Treaty, which was really unfair and really humiliated Germany. So at the end of World War II, a lot of us, countries are saying, hey, we can't do that again. We've got to do it differently. We can't punish Germany. We have to rebuild Germany. We have to make friends with Germany, or we're going to have a third war with Germany. The Soviet Union, though, the havoc and the death and destruction that the Nazis invoked in Russia, in the Soviet Union during World War II, was so catastrophic that the Germans just had really punished the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union wanted payback, and they wanted to punish Germany. You've got to understand that, because when you look at Germany, here's what's going to happen. Here's the basic plot. The French and the British and the Americans are going to be rebuilding Germany. Like, hey, we know we just had a war with you, but let's make friends and let's rebuild your cities that we blew up. So they start to rebuild Germany and turn it into a vibrant, democratic, nice place again. The United States pours in billions of dollars in something called the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. And of course, we say, hey, if we rebuild your country, you promise to buy your stuff from us. That way, we're getting a benefit from this too. However, in the eastern part of Germany, the Soviet Union wanted to punish Germany, so they weren't rebuilding, and they were trying to punish. So a lot of people who were living in the Soviet area, the Soviet area of Germany, wanted to get out, and that's going to cause some serious problems. So I just used the word Marshall Plan. After World War II, the US spent money, I mean millions, billions of dollars, to make friends in Europe by giving away food and supplies to any country that promised to buy US goods. We kind of had learned some lessons from World War I, where we said, hey, if we keep rubbing Germany's nose in this, we're going to have a third war with them. So we were trying to play nice. And it wasn't just Germany. We were willing to rebuild France, or to help out the British, or help in Italy. I already mentioned helping Greece. So the United States was trying to get friends in Europe. And the best way to get friends is to buy them, right? So the Marshall Plan was a major effort in the United States. Now, you've got to understand something to understand the Berlin airlift. And I'm going to pause. I'm going to go back to this map one more time. Remember, the capital of Berlin is completely surrounded by Soviet territory. But the city of Berlin, see this little dot? That's what this is, the city of Berlin. It's also divided up into 4 quadrants. But remember, the French, the British, and the United States were trying to make peace and rebuild Berlin, while the Soviets were punishing the people that lived there. Okay? So Stalin said, hey, I'm gonna keep Berlin. I'm gonna keep the whole thing. And I'm pretty sure the US isn't gonna start another war over this. So he cuts off rail lines going into Berlin. And the United States decided that we were going to fly in supplies to our sectors of Berlin, Germany's capital city. So it's a famous part of the Cold War where the United States spends millions of dollars, and hundreds of thousands of flights are flown into Berlin, bringing supplies in. I remember watching a documentary about this one pilot. He had been a bomber pilot during World War II, but after World War II, he stayed around and he started flying supplies into Berlin. So instead of dropping bombs, he was flying in supplies, and he would collect candy. This sounds kind of silly, but he'd collect candy. And when he would fly over Berlin, he would drop candy. And the kids knew he marked his plane with these special indicators on his wings and stuff. So the kids would know when that plane flew over, he was going to bomb the city with candy. And the kids would get all excited. These little German kids who had grown up, because we were trying to make peace, right? We just had this devastating war. So the Berlin airlift was a major act of help to those people who were living in West Berlin. Now, if you can follow on the logic of this, the Berlin Wall, made to keep the people in East Berlin from leaving to the US, UK, and French zones. I'm sure you've heard of the Berlin Wall. Here's the thing. If you lived somewhere in, say, East Germany under Soviet occupation, It was bad. It wasn't nice. They weren't rebuilding. They weren't being friendly. They were punishing. So instead of trying to get out of East Germany, what if you just lived in Berlin? And instead of trying to get out of East Germany, all you had to do was just cross a street from the Soviet sector into the French sector or to the American sector, and they would treat you nice and you had a good life. And the Soviets didn't like this, so they started building a wall in the city of Berlin, kind of like just encapsulating the entire western sector of Berlin with fences, barbed wire fences, and military patrols, and then an actual physical wall in the middle of Berlin. Okay? So it was made to keep people in East Berlin from leaving. And the Truman Doctrine, remember that Roosevelt was president of the United States at the end of World War II, but he died. He had been elected to his fourth term and he died. And Truman, the vice president, becomes president. And at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union was like a steamroller and the biggest army in the planet Earth. And even though they had the biggest casualty rate in World War II, they were significantly powerful and people were kind of sick of war. And so the US says, look, we're not going to be able to stop Stalin, but maybe we can stop him from spreading and taking over more of the world. And so the US started to adopt a policy of containment. If we can just contain communism where it is and stop communism from spreading globally, people called it like the domino theory. If one country falls, then another will. And it looked like it was true. Like China goes communist after World War II. And then Korea, North Korea, right? And then North Vietnam. And it looks like these places just keep falling to communism, like a stack of dominoes. And so the United States started this policy of containment. Can we contain it where it is? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. You got to know your geography. You guys hopefully know your geography, that this is Germany today. But when I was growing up, there was two Germanys, literally two Germanys. One was West Germany, the old French, British, and American sectors, and there was East Germany, which technically the Soviets said it was an independent country, but everybody knew the Soviets were running it. There were also countries that the Red Army had conquered on their way to Germany, like Poland. So Poland was a communist country. It wasn't a part of the Soviet Union, but it was a Soviet bloc country. Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania, those were all within the Soviet bloc. Now, Yugoslavia is a little different because Yugoslavia was communist, but they didn't take orders from the Soviet Union. So they're kind of an oddball out. They just like, hey, we're going to do our own communist thing. But a lot of the Western powers kind of clumped them into the same category because they were still communist. So it's interesting. Wherever the Red Army took over, beating the Nazis, they kept within their sphere of influence. Now, I'm not even talking about places like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova. Like those were literally a part of the Soviet Union. These were just Soviet bloc, the communist bloc or the Soviet bloc of countries. They're going to form something that we call the Warsaw Pact, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. This is the Berlin airlift. U.S. planes landing every few minutes to bring supplies into the U.S., French, and British sectors to try to keep Berlin under our control so that Stalin didn't win. We almost went into World War III right away. Okay, people say the Cold War starts, right around this time. I mean, maybe the Berlin airlift is one of the first stages of the Cold War, where we said we're not going to give up our rights to part of the German capital. The Berlin Wall lasted for several decades. 1989, boy, that's right when I'm in middle school, and I remember hearing stories and watching movies and news reports about the Berlin Wall, where people from East Berlin were trying to escape into West Berlin. And I remember in 1989 watching news reports of the Berlin Wall being torn down and Germany reuniting. And that's a huge thing, especially if you lived during the 1900s, the 20th century. The United States and the Russians and the French and the British fought 2 wars with Germany. So letting Germany reunite was a big deal, and it's right at the end of the Cold War. Again, it's 1989 as Germany reunites. So today on the map, there's just one Germany, and it's an integrated country. But you can still get a little feel for the old Soviet area over in Eastern Germany. Now, as I've been talking today, and one of the most important things to discuss is nuclear weapons. And the long term problems of nuclear weapons is probably the most significant impact of the Cold War. At the height of the Cold War, there were about 70,000 nukes, nuclear weapons in the world. And both sides understood the idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction. The concept is if you've got let's just cut this in half to make it easy. If the United States and her allies have 35,000 nuclear warheads and the Soviets have 35,000 and her allies have 35,000 nuclear warheads, it doesn't matter who strikes first. Life on this planet would cease to exist. Now, the truth is, the Soviets probably had more nuclear weapons than the United States did. And there was some debate as to whose nukes were better. I'm glad we didn't test that and prove it, I'm glad that both powers kind of stepped down, but we still have a lot of nukes on the planet Earth today. We don't have 70,000. We've decommissioned a lot. We've kind of brought the tension down, but we still have plenty to destroy life on the planet. Today, here's something interesting. When I was growing up, I thought, well, once a nuclear bomb's been invented, then everybody has it, right? So when I was growing up, I thought, well, everybody's got nukes now, but it's not true. There's only 9 countries on the planet Earth today that have nukes. Do you know what those 9 countries are? Well, the winners of World War II, and then there's a couple of rising stars, if you will. So the winners of World War II, the United States, Russia, old school Soviet Union, the United Kingdom or Great Britain, France, and China. Those are the winners of World War II. Here's a random oddball. Here's a random one. Israel. The reason I colored Israel different is because everybody knows Israel has nukes, but Israel doesn't necessarily admit it publicly. How did Israel get nukes? Well, the United States funded Israel's military, and we funded them as a country, and we were one of the biggest promoters of the state of Israel. After the Holocaust and how the Jews were treated in Europe, we wanted to make sure that they had a homeland in their original homeland. And so most people would think that the United States kind of helped Israel get nukes to defend herself against her enemies. The countries surrounding Israel have attacked the country of Israel at least 3 times in the decades of the Cold War. There are a couple of rising stars. India is the world's second biggest population, a gigantic, huge economy, and they have nuclear weapons, along with their arch rival, Pakistan. When the British controlled India, India and Pakistan were in the same country. They were the same country. It was British, South Asia, British India, part of the British Empire. But when India got independence, Pakistan broke off, and they become rivals, and they both have nukes, and they're really tense at each other. So that's kind of scary. And of course, North Korea is the one that's been flaunting it the last few years. It's a communist country, and they've been doing missile testing and provoking things, and it's a little bit scary. Also, Iran is maybe working to get them. Both of our last presidents and our current president, Barack Obama and Trump, there's been a nuclear deal with Iran to try to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons or nuclear technology. Iran says, well, we're going to get it. We're just going to use it for energy plants. And everybody's like, well, I don't know. And Israel says if Iran gets nukes, we're going to nuke them. So there's some tense things in the world still today with nuclear weapons. But those are the big 9. That's not a very big list. That's the nuclear club. Okay. Today, there's probably more like 20,000 nukes today. Okay. Later in the Cold War, the reason that there was 70,000 and now there's only 20,000 is because in the later years of the Cold War, both sides met for SALT treaties, strategic arms limitation talks, SALT treaties. They met in different places, like in, say, Stockholm, Sweden, or Oslo, Norway, or Reykjavik, Iceland. They meet different places in more neutral countries and try to discuss. I mean, how do you do that? How do you say, hey, man, you've got 30,000 nukes and we've got 30,000 nukes, and this is not good. And it's costing us so much to keep those up to date. Our economies are getting destroyed trying to compete with each other. What if we super duper promise to decommission some of ours if you promise to decommission some of yours? Yeah, well, how do we know you're going to decommission some of yours? Well, what if you send some of your scientists over to watch us take apart some of ours, and we send some of our scientists over to watch you take apart some of yours, right? Those are the strategic arms limitation talks. In modern day, countries have all, well, not all, that's the problem, not all have agreed to a non-proliferation treaty. North Korea doesn't agree to this. They're still testing them. But here's the problem, guys. If you light off a nuclear weapon, no matter where it is, we're all sharing the same air. We're all breathing the same air. And that's a huge problem, right? So it doesn't matter where you light that nuke off, it's going to have ramifications on the entire planet. And so most countries have agreed not to test nukes out in the open. If they want to test nukes, they have to build underground testing chambers to test it. But North Korea is not always playing by this non-proliferation treaty. So when World War II ended, we were dealing with what we called A-bombs, atomic bombs. They're atomic radioactive fission bombs. You're splitting atoms and releasing potential energy. And you need special isotopes, right? Like plutonium or uranium, right? And you have to have a certain kind. So you have to enrich the uranium. And it takes a huge industry and a huge chemical industry and really hardcore, science behind it all. However, later in the Cold War, starting with the United States, but followed up by the Soviet Union, we started to develop what we call H bombs. These are hydrogen thermonuclear fusion bombs. And I'm not going to try to get into all the science of it, nor am I going to try to pretend that I understand all the science of it. But if fission is splitting atoms, fusion is fusing atoms together, and it's weird because it creates an even bigger and badder explosion. So the original atomic bombs that we used, like say in Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, are nothing compared to the thermonuclear bombs that we're using at the end of the Cold War, or the kind we have today. Now, I want you to look at this chart here for a few minutes and try to grasp what I'm saying, because if you don't look at this right, you'll miss the whole point. This right here is the Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world when the first atomic bomb went off. And right next to it, this little dash right here is the tallest building in the world today in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, right? The Burj Khalifa. That's how big the tallest building in the world is compared to the atomic mushroom cloud, right? You've heard of the mushroom clouds when an atomic bomb goes off. This is what it looked like in Hiroshima, that killed just under 100,000 people in the original blast, let alone the radioactive fallout. Now, again, I don't know how much science you know, but if you know the stratosphere, the troposphere, look on this chart of this is height, right? Look at altitude. Here's the highest mountain on the planet Earth, Mount Everest. This right here is the largest bomb the United States ever lit off to test. To test. It's called Castle Bravo. To test. Are you kidding me? Look at that. And how many did we have of these? This is one bomb. One. And we were saying we had 70,000 at the height of the Cold War. I hope you're listening, and I hope you're soaking in how significant the Cold War really was. And by the way, Castle Bravo is not the biggest bomb ever tested. The biggest bomb ever tested was Tsar Bomba. The Soviets lit off something called Tsar Bomba. Remember Castle Bravo I just showed you? This one that was so catastrophically big? That's Bravo, Castle Bravo. See these little tiny dots down here? That's Hiroshima. Tsar Bomba was the biggest bomb ever tested. And when the Soviets lit it off, when they tested it and then shot video of it from a long ways away, they said, "Here's the problem, guys. We lit the bomb off at half capacity. The bomb was actually twice as powerful, but we weren't quite sure what that would do." Anyways, a little video right here of Oppenheimer kind of quoting from that in the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, where he says, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." Guys, it's hard, really hard for us to try to comprehend. Now, how big of a threat is North Korea? They have 15 bombs, and their bombs are not Tsar Bomba size. They're honestly playing around with more Hiroshima stuff. But still, Hiroshima stuff killed 100,000 people. Okay? So we estimate, we don't know. North Korea probably has under 50. This one says 15. This is a couple years ago. The United States is saying we have some, 6,500, and Russia similar. United Kingdom and France, India, Pakistan, and China, right? Those are the key players. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 key players. Okay? What really gets scary during the Cold War is not necessarily the fact that we have nuclear bombs, but the delivery system. The delivery system for nuclear weapons becomes the clincher. Because remember, in World War II, to drop Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, Fat Man and Little Boy, we had to fly a plane over their airspace and drop it from a high altitude and then get out of the way real quick, right? So you don't blow up your own plane. But so that's what we're talking about at the end of World War II. But at the end of World War II, we started messing around with rocket technology. Actually, the Nazis were way ahead of everyone else in rocket technology. If you really know your history, you've heard of maybe like the V1 or the V2 rockets that the Nazis were using, and even some of the early like experimental Nazi jet planes at the end of the war were like light years ahead of what everybody else had. And some of the best scientists in the world were Nazis. And so at the end of the war, the United States tried to give immunity or a safe place for Nazi scientists to come to the United States if they promised to help us develop rocket technology. And it kind of turns into a space race. At first, it's all about how do you deliver a nuclear weapon to a target. And so we started, the real problem is we started putting them in submarines, because you can park a submarine anywhere, almost undetected. Or you have these rockets. It kind of turns into a space race, and it's not really about space. It's if you can have a rocket reach the out of escape orbit, then you can launch a rocket anywhere on the planet Earth. And so the space race and the nuclear arms race really go hand in hand, as both countries were trying to create these intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. And today, almost every country has this technology. North Korea is trying. North Korea says they have rockets that can reach the west coast of the United States. We have rockets we say can go to Mars. We've landed people on the moon. China is the latest country to land a rover on the moon. So we have rocket technology to deliver weapons anywhere on the planet Earth and outside of the planet Earth. And so that's really what the space race was all about. And the space race was really a technology race between the Soviet Union and the United States, really focusing on the delivery system of nuclear weapons. And who won the space race? I don't know if you know much about the space race. If I ask you, what country was the first country to go to space? The Soviet Union. What country was the first country to put a satellite in orbit? The Soviet Union. What country was the first country to put an animal in space? The Soviet Union. A dog, right? And then monkeys. What country was the first one to put a man in space? The Soviet Union. What country was the first one to put a woman in space? The Soviet Union. What was the first country to put an object on the moon? The Soviet Union. Are you getting the idea here? The United States was spending a ton of money to beat the Soviet Union, and we fell behind on everything until we said we are the first ones to put a person on the moon. That's the place where we beat them. So that's why it's such a conspiracy theory about the first lunar landings, because that was such a big deal. Okay? The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb a few years after World War II. At the end of World War II, some people think that Truman used the bomb to kind of show the Soviets, hey, you better back down. Even though we dropped it on Japan, it was kind of a sign to Stalin, hey, don't push us. We have technology you don't have. Okay? But the Soviets still the plans for the atomic bomb and soon developed their own. After World War II, there's really just two countries that dominate the politics of the world for the entire Cold War. Great Britain was exhausted. France had been beat up. All those old European powers were really diminished and delinquished from World War II. So who's left? Russia, the Soviet Union. And they were beat up pretty bad too, but they ended up on the winning side in a position of power. And, some people think that they were on the verge of collapse. Really, it's the United States that comes out as the dominant superpower. And they tried to divide the world between each other, and they polarized world conflicts, fighting proxy wars. What's a proxy war? Well, if the United States supplies one army with weapons and the Soviet Union supplies the other army with weapons, even though the United States and the Soviets aren't fighting directly, we're using this country as pawns in our own conflict. And it's still going on. I mean, there's still civil war happening in Syria right now in the year 2020, 2021. And the it's not Soviet Union anymore, it's Russia, but Russia backs one side and the US backs another side. So maybe that's not to the extent it was in Vietnam and Korea or other places like Afghanistan, but there still is some of that tension left over, for sure. The Cold War creates a Red Scare in the United States. We thought that communists had infiltrated our government. We thought that some of the actors and directors in Hollywood were promoting communist ideas in their movies. So there was a Hollywood blacklist. There was a senator who was going on I'm using air quotes here, a witch hunt, McCarthyism, accusing U.S. politicians of being communists, and they'd lose their jobs. And there was the Congressional House on Un-American Activities Committee that was just ruining people's lives because we thought that the communists were infiltrating our country. And maybe they were. Maybe they did. Remember, after World War II, the United Nations is established as a forum for countries to resolve conflicts without bloodshed. The UN replaced the League of Nations, which failed in its duty after World War I. Remember, the League of Nations was created after World War I as a place to try to have treaties and to try to stop military alliances. The United States promoted the League of Nations, then never joined. So the UN replaces that, and it's supposed to act as a place where countries can come, talk about their issues, and resolve those peacefully. And it's a huge deal. The winners from World War II still run the UN today. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council. There's 15 countries on the Security Council. 10 of those countries rotate, but 5 have permanent veto status, meaning that if one of them disagrees with a UN decision, it stops any one of those 5, and they're the 5 winners of World War II. The United States, Russia, China, France, Great Britain. Okay? Of course, Stalin is the first real leader of the Soviet Union. Remember, Vladimir Lenin is the guy who initiates the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Remember, he's not even in Russia when the revolution erupts, at least the February Revolution. And remember, the Germans helped sneak him into Russia. and he kind of stokes the fire that's already there. And the initial February Revolution kicks the Tsar out of power, and they put in that temporary provisional government, if you remember our Russian Revolution discussion. And then Vladimir Lenin, leads Russia for a few years while they're in the midst of civil war. And right when the Soviet Union is being declared and the Civil War is over and the Red Army beats the White Army, Lenin dies. And so there's kind of a power struggle, like Trotsky and Stalin are kind of duking it out. And of course, the man of steel comes out on top, and he's one of the most ruthless men who's ever lived on the planet Earth. And he leads the Soviet Union during World War II. And after World War II, when he dies, again, it's going to be one of those problems. Who's going to take over after him? And I'll go over some of the key Soviet leaders in a minute. Here's some key terms for the Cold War. The Kremlin. That's like the center. It's like, say, if you go to the heart of Moscow, there's Red Square. And again, red is like the symbolic color of communism. The Kremlin is sort of a building, but it's also sort of an organization. It's kind of what runs the Soviet Union. It's where the Politburo meets. Okay, where the Politburo met at the heart of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. The Politburo is like the leaders of the Communist Party. Okay, after World War II, Winston Churchill actually lost his prime minister position in Great Britain, and he went on a tour of the United States giving speeches, and he said that we have a bigger problem than Hitler. Okay, Hitler's done, but we can't stop. There's still a menace in Europe, and that's communism and Stalin. And he used this symbolic imagery of an iron curtain, symbolic term used by Churchill describing the eastern parts of Europe that was under control of the Soviet Union after World War II. So the United States formed an alliance. The United States and Western European countries like Great Britain and France and Italy joined in. And, well, I'll show you a map. I've already shown you the map of the countries that kind of joined NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And here's what they said, basically. They said, if the Soviets attack any country in NATO, we'll feel like you've attacked all of us. And so it was kind of to help keep Stalin in check. It's still used in our world today. The truth is, it wasn't the United States that invaded Afghanistan after 9/11. It was NATO, right? Like a coalition of countries backed by the United States. NATO forces went into Iraq. So the United States rarely does anything on its own. It usually is a part of a bigger group called NATO today. It's basically the old allies plus the countries we beat in World War II minus Russia. Okay, Russia was kind of all on its own, so it formed its own little group. They called it the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw is the capital of Poland. So the Warsaw Pact was the Soviet Union and its satellite countries. Those are the countries in Eastern Europe under the influence or control by the Soviet Union. Okay, I've got some great videos. What is NATO? Okay, the Warsaw Pact. Okay, Warsaw Pact and NATO were kind of like the US team was NATO and the Soviet team was the Warsaw Pact. And of course, this is the time period of espionage, right? Spy games. After Stalin died, the next significant leader is Nikita Khrushchev. And he becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union. And he actually acknowledges how bad Stalin was. Everybody kind of got into this frenzy of they couldn't even use Stalin's name without being scared of being killed. I mean, it was bad. And Khrushchev comes in and he says, look, Stalin was a bad guy, and we don't have to necessarily equate communism with Stalinism. And so he tried to separate who Stalin was from the way communism could work. And so he tried to de-Stalinize Russia. He was a hardline communist, and he took some crap for kind of backing it down a little bit. But he also took Soviet Union and the United States closest to World War III with like the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the United States and the Soviet Union were spying on each other. That's a big part of the Cold War. Soviet spies, still U.S. secrets by espionage. There was a couple, an old couple, looked like grandma and grandpa couple, she's baking cookies and, they have this cute little American home, but they were being paid by the Russians to help smuggle state secrets, right? They're called the Rosenbergs, and then they were executed. And so people start thinking anybody could be a Russian spy. Your neighbor could be a Russian spy. Of course, the United States was spying on the Soviet Union as well. I kind of told you earlier about the U-2 spy plane incident. We told Russia we weren't spying on them, and then they shot down our plane and had one of our pilots captive. We're talking spy stuff like this guy had cyanide tablets. He was supposed to kill himself rather than be taken prisoner, but he didn't want to kill himself, so he got taken prisoner. The United States formed what we called the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. It still exists, right? If you know anything about spy agencies, the Central Intelligence Agency was to gather info on countries, but we also did other stuff I put in quotes like we can never officially say we ordered assassinations and overthrew governments, but we did, right? Um, and of course, the British had their own secret agency, MI6. You probably heard of MI6, right? We're talking like James Bond kind of stuff. All the old James Bond movies where Soviets were the bad guys and the British were the good guys, or the Americans, in our spy games. Of course, the Soviets had their own committee for state security. They called it the KGB. Today, it's the FSB. Anyways, the KGB doesn't look like it would interpret this way, but that's because it's in Russian. We're trying to use Russian words and English definitions. Anyways, the KGB was the Soviet Union's secret service and spy network during the Cold War. The modern leader of Russia, if you go look, who's the president of Russia right now and has been for several decades, his name is Putin, Vladimir Putin. He was in the KGB when he was younger. He was like a spy during the Cold War. The guy who runs Russia today was a KGB, a Soviet agent. Interesting. Now, who were some of the key leaders? I talked about Lenin. I talked about Stalin. I talked a little bit about Khrushchev. There's another dude you have to pay attention to. His name is Brezhnev. The last real leader is Gorbachev. He has an unfortunate birthmark. I remember this guy was a big deal when I was growing up. He's the guy who kind of ends the Cold War in a whimper, not a shout. Thankfully for Gorbachev, he helped bring the Soviet Union down peacefully instead of World War III. Closest we ever came to World War III was the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay, in 1962. And I've got some important information on that in videos later on. One of the people who helped end the Cold War, and sometimes he gets forgotten about, is the Pope. John Paul II. He was the first Pope from Poland. He was Polish. And that was a communist country. And so there was kind of a spark of religiosity or religious fervor in communist countries where communism suppressed religion. Remember that most communist countries will not allow religion. They see religion as the opium of the masses. That's one of the things that like Americans don't like about communism because we believe in religious freedom and communism suppressed it. So the Pope, because he was from Poland, had a big role in kind of, reigniting Catholic ideas in Poland. And a lot of the people who were Russian Orthodox started to want to revive religion. And so religion does play an end in the Cold War. In fact, there was a big deal that happened during this whole Cold War era where the Vatican was having pressure put on it to maybe bring the Catholic Church into modern times. And so the Catholic Church did change some of its doctrine, change some of its policies, maybe is a better word for that. It was the first time where they allowed vernacular mass. I don't know if you know what that means, but before 1962, mass had to be done in Latin. Latin is the language of the Romans. So if you went to mass in the United States, in France, mass was done in Latin. So unless you speak Latin, you don't get a lot out of it. What if they could do mass in English in the United States, or do it in French in France, or do it in German in Germany? That seems like a duh, But that wasn't done until the Second Vatican Council. And the church had to address things like birth control and abortion. And it took hard lines on some of it, but it also had to give in, and it had to kind of modernize itself a little bit. And it does have an effect on the Cold War. There were Cold War uprisings, especially in Hungary in the 50s, that the Soviets crushed. There, of course, is the famous year 1968 with student protests. Think of the hippie era, right? Make love, not war kind of ideas, not just in the United States, but across Europe. They call it the Prague Spring. Prague is the capital of Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic. And again, the Soviets suppressed this. But then in the 1980s, there was like this Polish solidarity movement, especially being influenced by this rise and a revitalization of Catholicism. And it was a Christian movement in a lot of ways, where they started to resist they started to resist communism. So they weren't just anti-communist for political reasons, but also for spiritual reasons. And I put that down. 68 is a big year of student protest in the West, France, Great Britain, United States, San Francisco, right? New York, and all over the place. Hippies, right? That whole, right? Here's the big deal. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the end of the 1970s. It's really the 1980s. And they wanted to back a communist government in Afghanistan. But this war became super unpopular. And interestingly enough, the United States saw a chance to fund Afghan rebels. And so that's when we started funding and giving intelligence and information and weapons and strategies and supplies to rebels in Afghanistan. Those same rebel groups eventually become Al Qaeda and the Taliban. It's almost like we were supplying Osama bin Laden, the guy who did 9/11. He was like our hitman over in Afghanistan to try to take out the Soviets. And it's not that simple, but essentially the CIA helped secretly fund Afghan rebels to bring down the Soviet Union. And of course, we did talk about Brezhnev, who was the last real hard-line Soviet leader, because Gorbachev helps bring down the Soviet Union. So these are protests across Europe and the United States during the 60s, that whole hippie era. These are the Soviet Union cracking down on protests in Warsaw Pact countries, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, okay, places like that. This is some interesting information on the Cold War in Cuba. This is big to Americans because Cuba is right off the coast. When JFK first became president, there was already a CIA operation to help Cuban refugees, Cuban exiles, go back to their country and kick out the communist leader Fidel Castro. It's so poorly planned, and information is leaked, and it's a disaster. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion because there's a bay in Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. And it's not supposed to be an American thing. We were supplying them, but anyways, it's a failure and it embarrasses us. That's why the Cubans felt like they needed to go to the Soviet Union and say, hey, the US just tried to invade our country. I mean, they didn't, but we know they backed the people who did. And so that's why they start working with the Soviet Union to get nuclear weapons deployed in Cuba. And it's the closest we ever came. Okay. So it says after Fidel Castro became the leader of Cuba, the United States deployed 15 nuclear-tipped Juniper missiles to Turkey. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1962, initiated by American ballistic missile deployment in Italy and Turkey, right? So we were putting nukes in Turkey, we put nukes in Italy, and then the Russians say, well, we're going to put them in Cuba. And Cuba wanted them to because of the whole Bay of Pigs invasion. So there's always more to the story. Mikhail Gorbachev was the last leader or general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He introduced two major themes. One was called Glasnost. Okay, during the 1980s, Gorbachev called for more openness and transparency of the Soviet government. Hey, we're going to stop doing everything in secret and be more open with everybody. He also instigated what he called perestroika, where he tried to reform and restructure the government. So glasnost is more like open press, maybe not quite freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but heading that direction. Whereas perestroika was actually reforming and restructuring the government. Okay, but those two things, glasnost and perestroika, help bring an openness. I remember, this might be too much, but I remember when I was a kid, we read about the Soviet Union, and people in the Soviet Union had never had McDonald's before. I know this sounds stupid, but the first McDonald's that ever opened up in the Soviet Union was out of control. Like, the Soviets were going crazy for it because they didn't have capitalism and surplus and economic motivation, right? It was all communist and everything was drear and drab, and they didn't have blue jeans, rock and roll, MTV, and McDonald's. And this glasnost and perestroika started to open up the Soviet Union. And the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were some of the first republics to declare independence. And everybody thought, oh no, it's going to be the Prague Spring all over again. It's going to be the Hungarian Revolt, or it's going to be the same thing over again. But Boris Yeltsin kind of like stood in front of tanks, in front of the Duma, and he was like a hero. He was helping Russia to not crack down on these Baltic states. And because he was such a hero, he became the first president of Russia after the Soviet Union broke apart. Now, he's not known in history as maybe the best leader, but how could you take a country from a communist government into a capitalistic one? Well, the Russian mob takes over, and people are completely scared about nuclear weapons getting in their hands of the wrong people because the Soviet government is falling apart. And Boris Yeltsin, he ends up he loses to a guy named Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, is still the leader of Russia today. He's a former KGB agent, and he's really been the leader of Russia since 2000. So we're talking over 20 years. Now, somebody might point out, well, there was one time where he wasn't president. Yeah, he was prime minister, but he had the constitution of Russia changed so that he could serve indefinitely. And then when he was back, he went back and became president. Everybody knew he was running the show still. So really, you could argue that, but Vladimir Putin has been the leader really since the Soviet Union broke apart. Boris Yeltsin was the first one, but Vladimir Putin came in and has really been the strong man there. And there's no sign of him ever leaving until he dies, and who knows when that's going to be. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Caucasus region openly rebelled against Russia, and there was major violence and terrorism for years to come in a place called Chechnya. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan technically broke away, but there was even parts of Russia that wanted to break away, like Chechnya and Dagestan. And anyway, some serious problems as the Soviet Union was breaking apart. Anyways, by 2019, Gorbachev is still alive. The last Soviet leader, he's alive during your lifetime, okay? Détente is trying to cool things down. President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, and the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher, were good friends, and they're kind of seen as really opening up to like people like Gorbachev and really trying to cool things down. Remember, détente is that easing of Cold War tension without annihilation, right? People like Barack Obama and Donald Trump, they've met with Vladimir Putin, the guy who was a KGB spy during the Cold War. These are really the only two leaders of Russia since the Cold War, okay? For all intents and purposes. I think we've done a good job of kind of explaining how bad nuclear weapons were and how much worse they are now. And that kind of brings us to the end of the Cold War. There's an entirely different topic that we need to discuss next week that takes place during the same time. It's called decolonization. So if you think, man, Mr. Moore, you totally missed a major part of this 4-decade era, don't worry, we're going to cover that next week on decolonization. Thank you so much for being with me today. Next week, we'll deal with decolonization. This is the Cold War from the end of World War II up to the 1990s. Thanks for being with me. We'll see you next week.